You're watching this video because you want to quit your job and travel the world.
That was us 2 years ago until we saved $30,000, put on our backpacks, and bought a one-way flight to Mexico.
But was $30,000 enough? How far did it get us? And where did most of the money go?
We are going to split this video into 3 sections. First, how we spend the $30,000 and give you the cost breakdown of our trips. Then, we're going to show you how you can calculate your own budget for a full year of traveling based on an Excel template that we have built to make it even easier for you. And lastly, all the tips that we learned on how you can keep your costs low while you travel.
So let's get into it. Let's talk about how we actually spent the $30,000. With this money, we were able to travel to 12 countries, 3 in Central America, 3 in Southeast Asia, and 6 in Europe. But because we jumped from country to country so often, a lot of it went to flights. To be precise, $7,672 were spent on flights. And this was a big mistake. We will talk about this later on in the video, but the reality is that because we wanted to see so much, we were just flying from place to place and spending so much money on flights, when we should have really chosen one part of the world to see in depth, and that would have been much more affordable. Apart from the flights, we have to take into account accommodation and life expenses. And the biggest difference here was really the country we were on, because for example in Costa Rica, we spent this much money, as opposed to Bali, where we spent this much money. Europe in general was one of our most expensive trips because we spent roughly $150 per day. But of course, we were traveling countries like Italy and Austria, whereas in Southeast Asia, we spent a lot less money per day. But Southeast Asia in general is much more affordable and our favorite place to backpack in the world. Because our travels were a mix of expensive countries and more affordable ones, our total average per day traveling came up to $101, and that's for 2 people. Now, if you make the maths, you'll realize that at this cost, we wouldn't have enough money to travel for the whole year. So we only traveled for 180 days. For the remainder of the time, we were working on certain projects, spending time with family, and just being home in general. So let's run it back to the totals. From the $30K we had initially, we spent $7,672 on flights. We then, for 180 days of traveling, spent $18,180 for accommodation and overall travel expenses. We also spent $520 for travel insurance, which by the way, saved our lives almost literally. So we definitely recommend you to think about travel insurance, and we recommend you HeyMondo because we used them and they were so amazing. Link in the description for a discount code. Big disclaimer, 30K wasn't really enough for us, but that's because we were staying in nice places, we were traveling a lot, and we were purchasing long flights from different continents. But we definitely think you can travel with a lot less money than that. In fact, I will let Alba show you how you can calculate your budget so that your finances and your travel plans match.
To help you guys budget your trip, we have created an Excel sheet and it's super easy to use. You can start by adding your budget, let's say for example 30,000, or you can leave this to the end if you first want to see how much the trip is gonna cost you. You can do that as well. And then further down in this section, you are just gonna have to add what are the places that you want to visit. So let's say for example that we want to include Guatemala in our trip. Then we need to think about how many days we want to spend there. So let's say we want to spend 25 days in Guatemala. The most important part is gonna be determining what is gonna be the cost per day for this trip. I have added some averages here of how much we've spent for 2 people in the last few trips that we've done, so you guys can use these costs as reference. But for Guatemala, for example, let's put $90, and it's gonna give you how much you're gonna need for that trip. Obviously, on top, you need to add the flight costs. So let's say that our flight to Guatemala is gonna cost us $800 if you're not coming from very far. This is going to start to fill up. So you can repeat this a few times with other destinations. There's also a section in the sheet dedicated for you to add how much you're going to spend on health insurance, because like we said, is very critical for when you're traveling, and also how much you're going to spend on what I called home admin, but this section is basically dedicated to any expense you think you're going to have throughout your travels back home. For example, you might keep your phone contract. Once you have filled it up with all of the destinations that you want to go to, you will see how much that's going to cost you, and you will be able to adjust your budget or adjust your trip based on that. For example, out of the $30,000 that we had allocated, $21,000 are already kind of gone for a trip of 130 days. So if we had done this exercise when we were planning our trip, we would have been able to see that a budget of $30,000 wouldn't have been enough for the trips that we wanted to do. As you can see, this is a super easy way to estimate how much you are gonna need to travel the world for a full year. It highly depends on where you want to go and how many days you're gonna spend in each destination. If you guys want this sheet, let me know in the comments. We are gonna move on to the final part of the video to help you decrease those travel costs. Throughout our trips, obviously, we learned a lot about how you can keep your costs low. So let's get started with the first tip.
Choose affordable destinations that match your traveling style. We were going to places like Costa Rica, Italy, Austria, but these are very expensive destinations if you think about it. And what we realized is that we were having so much more fun in Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines, like Malaysia, like Indonesia, and they were half of the price.
We were stressing out when we were being in these expensive locations because we were going over budget every day and we didn't manage to enjoy. So if you have to stick to a budget, just choose a destination that matches it. The second tip is to fly less. We've already mentioned this in this video, but it's so important because we spend so much money on flights. You could choose to spend more time in one big country like Vietnam or Indonesia to avoid long-haul flights, and there's still so much to explore in those places.
And that takes me to tip number 3. Take the bus. We realized that it doesn't matter which country you go to, whether it's Mexico, whether it's Costa Rica, even Italy, there's always an affordable bus route. Now, yes, if you take a flight, it will take you maybe an hour and it'll cost you 10 times more. Whereas a bus, maybe it'll be 7 hours. But hey, if you're traveling for real, this money will make a difference.
The next tip is to split the cost. We were lucky because we were traveling together, and if you're traveling alone, it can be a little bit harder. But what you can do is stay in a hostel to meet people. We found people, for example, in Costa Rica who were grouping up with other solo travelers to split the cost of a taxi because there was no other way of getting around than getting on a taxi, and it can be really expensive if you're paying it by yourself.
Tip number 5. Whenever you stay in a place for more than a week, try to choose a place that has a kitchen, aka a place where you can cook. The amount of money you can save by cooking your own meals is insane. There's really only a few countries where eating out is cheaper than cooking. One of them is Thailand. We really recommend you to not get a place with a kitchen, but in the majority of cases, try to find a place where you can cook.
Especially for those locations where you're gonna stay for a long period of time, it will be worth it. But for those times where you have to stay in a hotel, my next tip is to try to get a hotel with breakfast. Now, this seems like such a basic thing, and a lot of the times we think it's not worth it, but it really makes a difference.
It feels so nice to wake up, eat as much as you can for breakfast, and take off exploring. Whenever we don't have breakfast included, we end up just drinking a coffee and eating some biscuits, and we always end up being way too hungry before lunchtime.
So you end up spending more money on lunch and snacks, and it actually just fills you up for the day, and it does make a difference on your expenses as well. And the 7th and last tip is to use a platform that gives you rewards. Now, we are not the best with credit card rewards, so we will not give you tips for that, but also when you book your accommodation and your travel, you can be part of a program. We use Booking.com to get all of our accommodations, and also this is not sponsored, but we have like the highest tier of Genius, and that gives us like really good discounts when we're booking hotels. So if you stay loyal to a platform, it can pay back.
That's gonna be everything for today's video. Make sure to give it a like, subscribe, and comment how much money do you think you will need to quit your job and travel the world.
Thank you so much for being part of our travel family, and I guess we'll see you in our next video.